In a system where even pain must be authorized, the silent disappearance of thousands of messages following the death of a young actor revealed a disturbing truth that few dared to speak aloud. Even mourning can become a prohibited act. What for any society should be a natural space for compassion was transformed into a meticulous operation that erased words, images, and gestures of humanity with an almost mechanical speed, as if an immense shadow had descended upon every digital corner to dissipate not only the traces of a life, but the very possibility of feeling. While users tried to understand what had happened, the bewilderment grew at the pace of posts disappearing before they could generate dialogue. Suddenly, emotion remained suspended, frozen in a silence that was not the fruit of calm, but of control. However, that impeccably polished surface could not hide the questions emerging beneath the dull glow of the screens. What kind of structure fears memory so much that it decides to erase it even before it can settle in the heart of the public? What truth can be so disturbing that a collective farewell is considered risky in an environment marked by glamour and the apparent normality of show business? But behind the glamour and the excuses, what mechanisms really drive this crisis? We will analyze every detail, from the initial errors to the irreversible damage, to see how the world of entertainment functions and how an icon is redefined. The case of Yu Menglong, an actor whose image had been carefully associated with serenity and discipline, acquired an unexpected nuance when his death triggered the deepest digital purge in contemporary Chinese entertainment. At first glance, the contradiction seemed insurmountable. The massive disappearance of content did not correspond to the figure of a discreet performer, a stranger to scandals, whose trajectory had been built upon silent constancy rather than notoriety. The sensation of emptiness that followed that accelerated elimination caused the audience to face a painful paradox. It was not just the loss that generated disquiet, but the impossibility of processing it. In that lapse, social media transformed into a territory where emotion could not develop naturally, a space where spontaneity was relegated before the precision of a mechanism deciding what should remain standing and what should disappear without a trace. Between the lines, an uncomfortable understanding began to emerge. Perhaps the story was not limited to the passing of a young actor, but pointed to a deeper tension between individuals wishing to express their humanity and structures that police every emotional nuance circulating in the public sphere. What was at stake, from that instant, was not solely the memory of Yu Menglong, but the revelation of a dynamic in which silence could become both a tool and a warning. From this initial crack, the need to descend into the hidden layers of the industry became inevitable, marking the beginning of a search that would not only examine the immediate facts, but also the forces shaping, with almost surgical precision, the life and perception of those inhabiting the heart of the spectacle. As the surface of the imposed silence began to spread, it became evident that the story could not be understood without returning to the origin, to the territory where Yu Menglong's youthful ambition met a rigid system that molded artistic life with a precision exceeding any professional standard. Before his name became a reference point for international debate, there existed a young man whose trajectory seemed to follow the usual course of those who, from distant provinces, dreamed of reaching a place in the major studios. However, the luminous appearance projected by television dramas hid a denser gear mechanism, one that regulated everything from schedules to emotions, outlining a minimal margin for authentic expression. The industry demanded absolute discipline, as if visibility were a privilege that had to be paid for by renouncing spontaneity and rest. From day one, Yu Menglong understood that this universe functioned according to a tacit contract in which every gesture was observed, every word was calibrated, and every silence had a meaning interpreted beyond its original intention. His origins in Jiangsu and his upbringing in Xinjiang molded a serene temperament that contrasted deeply with the harshness of the professional environment he found upon entering the industry. Colleagues who shared those early projects with him remembered the thoroughness with which he studied every scene, adjusting small inflections, modulating breaths, building emotions that did not need stridency to reach the viewer. This ability to transmit intensity through subtlety quickly caught the attention of casting directors, who saw in that quiet presence a type of talent capable of sustaining a long-running drama. However, what seemed to many a luminous promise would become, over time, a source of silent vulnerability. The labor structure that was supposed to propel him toward recognition ended up eroding, little by little, the margins that allowed him to exist as an individual beyond the character. The contracts regulating his activity were designed to guarantee efficiency, but their fine print imposed a level of control surpassing the strictly professional. Workdays extending for 16 hours, absence of holidays, tacit prohibition of rejecting assigned projects, limitations on personal relationships, and constant supervision of behavior in public spaces configured an environment where autonomy was reduced to an almost symbolic minimum. The logic of this system started from an apparently simple premise. The image had to remain intact, free of cracks that could generate uncertainty in the audience. However, that premise turned daily life into an exercise of internal resistance. Artists learned from very early on that any manifestation of fatigue could be interpreted as a lack of commitment, and that the expression of discomfort was equivalent to a deviation from the emotional script expected of them. With the passage of time, changes in his appearance began to become perceptible. Although he maintained his kind attitude, his movements became slower, and his gaze acquired a caution that was not present in his early years. Several stylists mentioned marks on his face and neck, always covered with makeup before the cameras began to roll. The origin of those signs remained wrapped in prudent silence. In that environment, asking questions could have consequences, and self-censorship became a survival tool almost as necessary as any acting skill. In public interviews, Yu Menglong resorted to metaphors to describe his relationship with fame. One of his most cited phrases, "The light is heavy," initially went unnoticed, interpreted as a poetic reflection on the demands of work. Over time, that phrase acquired a revealing nuance. Those who knew him understood that this heaviness did not refer to superficial tiredness, but to a sustained emotional pressure, a sensation of burden forcing him to distance himself from what he cherished so as not to compromise the image he had to keep intact. This distancing inevitably affected his personal life. Although he spoke with affection about his family in some live broadcasts, the possibility of sharing moments with them was reduced due to the restrictions imposed by the industry. To protect his loved ones from any possible repercussions, he opted to maintain a prudent distance, reserving his emotions for spaces where surveillance did not reach. That decision did not respond to indifference, but to the responsibility of preventing the weight of his career from affecting those who did not belong to the world of show business. The absence of close emotional support, combined with the pace of work, configured a constant tension that found no visible outlet. The progressive increase of his presence on screen brought with it a more complex network of commitments. Rejecting an advertising campaign could be interpreted as a gesture of disobedience. Expressing fatigue could be considered a threat to the continuity of the public image. According to specialists in artistic management, the system fostered a culture where lack of rest was viewed as proof of professionalism. In this context, the line between dedication and extreme sacrifice blurred rapidly, creating an emotional scenario where strength was confused with the capacity to endure in silence. The accumulation of these demands began to mold an internal landscape marked by unexpressed tensions. His contained conduct, often interpreted as natural shyness, also reflected a strategy to avoid internal conflicts within the agency. Silence operated as a shield, allowing him to advance without drawing attention to the difficulties he faced. But that very silence increasingly reduced the space available to ask for help or share concerns. Emotional containment transformed into a way of life that accompanied him even in his moments of greatest public visibility. Observing this set of factors, it is understandable that his story resonated with such force after his passing. The contradiction between the public image of a disciplined young man and the oppressive environment in which he worked raised difficult questions about the mechanisms structuring artistic life. For many admirers, the tragedy resided not only in his death, but in the impossibility of having expressed the difficulties he was going through. That light he described as heavy revealed itself, over time, as a metaphor for a system demanding constant shine even when the wear and tear was evident. There, in that tension between appearance and reality, lay the first key to understanding why his story generated such a persistent echo in the heart of the public. What do you think of this? Comment Amen below so we can continue with the unfinished stories. The morning the news of Yu Menglong's passing spread with the speed typical of unexpected tragedies, digital platforms began to transform into a stage no one had foreseen. What should have been a space where emotion could expand naturally became a place where every gesture of farewell was withdrawn before finding an interlocutor. At first, many users thought it was a momentary glitch, perhaps a habitual maladjustment caused by an extraordinary increase in traffic. However, the pattern began to repeat with such disturbing precision that it soon became clear the situation surpassed any technical explanation. Messages disappeared without distinction, as if a silent force were deployed to prevent mourning from being expressed in public. As the day advanced, even the accounts of established celebrities observed how their posts were withdrawn seconds after being shared. Renowned actresses who attempted to express their condolences met the same void as the anonymous public. The impossibility of keeping even a neutral message visible laid bare that the operation did not respond to the natural movement of a saturated platform, but to a protocol acting uniformly, regardless of the author or the content. What remained was a strangely clean digital landscape, a silence that did not bring serenity, but bewilderment. The constant elimination of messages provoked a sense of emotional disorientation that grew with every failed attempt to honor the actor's memory. Social networks, usually overflowing with spontaneous reactions, appeared as a sterilized space where the absence of content was more eloquent than any public declaration. Some users described the experience as a sort of simultaneous memory wipe, an operation removing not only words, but also the possibility for collective emotion to find a legitimate channel. The lack of official explanations fed the confusion and gave rise to theories attempting to fill the void that the absence of information had left open. In that climate of uncertainty, an unexpected event agitated the atmosphere even more. Presenter Liu Wei briefly published a screenshot of a conversation with makeup artist Song Si, a close friend of the actor. The most disturbing phrase, "the world destroyed him," expanded rapidly before the post disappeared along with the entire account. The sudden disappearance of that trace fed the perception that this was not simply an attempt to avoid rumors, but a systematic effort to prevent any emotional interpretation of the event. That phrase, brief and forceful, signaled that behind the tragedy existed a burden of suffering that perhaps had never been openly expressed. Public reaction divided immediately. A part of the audience interpreted the content removal as a measure destined to avoid harmful speculation, with the intention of protecting the family's privacy and preventing the tragedy from being distorted by unverified versions. They considered it natural that, in such a delicate moment, an attempt was made to maintain certain control over information. However, another part of the public perceived the operation as a deliberate effort to control the narrative, an attempt to prevent the actor's death from triggering a broader debate on the industry's structural conditions. For this group, the imposed silence did not seek to protect, but to hide. The tension between both interpretations began to grow, creating an emotional fracture reflected in every corner of the platforms. The international repercussion added an unexpected nuance. Users from different countries began to collect and translate screenshots that had been eliminated in the original environment. What had disappeared in one space reappeared in another, multiplied by the interest generated by the very act of censoring. Platforms like Reddit, TikTok, and X became improvised archives where fragments of information found refuge. Every recovered piece carried with it a sense of urgency. If something had to be withdrawn with such insistence, then it must possess a value the community was determined to preserve. The dynamic acquired the form of an inverted mirror, where elimination did not erase, but amplified memory. Meanwhile, within the industry, the impact was felt with increasing intensity. Programs planned in advance began to postpone recordings. Previously agreed interviews were canceled without detailed explanations. Those artists who were supposed to appear at public events opted to withdraw temporarily, fearing that any statement, even the most innocent, could be interpreted as a deviation from the official framework. Communication agencies disseminated statements sharing a common tone of caution and discretion, a language designed not to open any door that could put the imposed narrative stability at risk. The uniformity of those messages reflected that a deeper directive existed, a tacit agreement to sustain a silence that seemed to function as a protective barrier against emotional chaos. Foreign media approached the phenomenon from a more analytical perspective. Some specialists in cultural politics interpreted the massive deletion as a sign of the tensions existing between the idealized image the country wished to project and the real complexity of its media structure. From that reading, the operation sought not only to manage a delicate event, but also to prevent the tragedy from transforming into a questioning of mental health, work pressure, and the limited autonomy of those forming part of the entertainment industry. The idea that a system could fear even collective mourning began to install itself as an indication of institutional fragility rather than a show of strength. For Yu Menglong's admirers, the experience became emotionally contradictory. On one hand, they wished to respect the family's privacy. On the other, they felt the need to preserve the actor's memory in an environment that seemed determined to erase any trace of his presence. Many began to resort to forms of symbolic expression, avoiding algorithmic scrutiny, images suggesting without naming, abstract phrases that only those following the case could interpret, shared silences functioning as an act of community. Those discrete signals, scattered in different digital corners, became small islands of memory, revealing the persistence of an emotional bond that could not be eliminated with the same ease as a message. Throughout this process, the imposed silence did not reduce public interest. On the contrary, it intensified it until turning the case into a phenomenon transcending borders. Every eliminated message fed the impulse to seek answers, to reconstruct what was being withdrawn. The tragedy ceased to be an isolated fact to transform into a reflection of the tensions emerging when a system attempts to administer not only information but also collective emotion. In that constant search, the audience began to understand that what was at stake was not solely the memory of an actor, but the right to experience and express humanity in an environment where even sadness seemed to need authorization. The silence extending after the massive disappearance of messages did not produce the calm some expected. On the contrary, it generated an emotional density settling over those who had closely followed Yu Menglong's trajectory. In the studios where he had worked, conversations diluted little by little, replaced by cautious glances suggesting not only sadness, but also a latent fear of the repercussions of uttering a word outside the established framework. The absence of verifiable information fed the impression that mourning had been displaced to an uncertain territory, a space where every question had to be formulated with extreme prudence. As the days advanced, the family opted to shelter in a respectful silence that intensified the sensation of collective emptiness. What was being lived was not simply a personal tragedy, but a moment in which memory seemed suspended between invisible forces defining what could be expressed and what had to disappear without a trace. This opacity molded an emotional tension expanding beyond digital platforms. Many admirers described a sense of powerlessness intensifying with every failed attempt to access a coherent version of the facts. The deliberate absence of data transformed every rumor into a threat, every reflection into a risk. In that climate, any gesture could be interpreted as a sign of transgression, and no participant in the public sphere seemed willing to assume responsibility for a comment that could unleash unexpected consequences. The tragedy, instead of advancing toward clarity, seemed to slide toward a terrain where the unspoken weighed more than any explicit declaration. Collective memory sought a point of support, but found only the cold surface of a system privileging narrative stability over emotional relief. When the environment reached that level of extreme containment, an event occurred, minimal in appearance but decisive in its effect. A brief video, recorded casually during a break in one of the actor's shoots, began to circulate on an international platform. It was a simple scene: Yu Menglong sitting next to a technical crew, conversing with someone off camera. The serenity of his smile, discreet and warm, produced a deep contrast with the oppressive climate dominating the public narrative. That image showed neither extravagance nor dramatic intensity. On the contrary, it revealed a quotidian humanity that no elimination mechanism seemed capable of dissolving. In that minimal gesture, a light was condensed that remained intact, a presence escaping the rigidity of any control structure. Users who found the video reacted with a mixture of tenderness and revelation. The authenticity of that instant returned to many the sensation that a fragment of truth still existed that could not be erased. In a matter of hours, the clip crossed digital and cultural borders, reaching communities unaware of the actor's history in detail, but who recognized the naturalness of his expression. The emotion it awakened did not arise from an elaborate speech, but from the silent evidence that humanity persists even when circumstances try to suppress it. From that moment, collective perception experienced an unexpected turn. The tragedy ceased to be an event trapped in a framework of restrictions and began to transform into a broader reflection on the right to preserve that which gives meaning to existence. The diffusion of the clip provoked a spontaneous movement within the industry. Some artists began to share symbolic works, illustrations, and compositions alluding to the persistence of light, to the difficulty of silencing an authentic emotion. Although these expressions eluded any direct reference to the case, those knowing the background interpreted them as signs of silent support, as ways to accompany the mourning without openly challenging the norms regulating public activity. This metaphorical language offered a bridge between respect for the institutional framework and the collective need to remember. With every gesture, however minimal, it was affirmed that dimensions of human experience existed that could not be reduced to an administrative protocol. That movement gave rise to a phenomenon some analysts termed expanded memory. The concept described the way the actor's memory extended through fragments escaping official frameworks: photographs saved by followers, translated comments, re-uploaded videos, details recovered from the personal archives of those who had worked with him. Memory, far from being confined by the initial restrictions, acquired an unexpected autonomy, multiplying in spaces the system could not reach to control. This process did not arise as a frontal challenge, nor as a gesture of confrontation. It was, rather, the silent expression of a deeply human impulse, the desire to preserve the dignity of a life that had touched thousands of people. The emotional impact of the clip was so profound that many users began to speak of a silent presence. The expression described a peculiar phenomenon: the sensation that the actor's memory continued influencing conversations even when his name was not explicitly mentioned. In that context, silence did not represent absence, but a space in which the public reconstructed the story from their own experience. Memory became an act of cultural resistance, a collective gesture questioning the idea that a narrative could be completely molded from a hierarchical structure. What had begun as a spontaneous gesture transformed into a collective affirmation regarding the importance of remembering even when open expression was restricted. The expansion of the case introduced a deeper reflection on the limits of information control. Several specialists pointed out that the suppression of content can temporarily contain the diffusion of certain elements, but cannot prevent the absence itself from transforming into a significant clue. The more the narrative was attempted to be led toward a point of absolute stillness, the greater the public's impulse to recover the scattered fragments and reconstruct them into a form allowing meaning to be granted to the experience. Social memory, instead of extinguishing, acquired an autonomous force, revealing the fragility of any system pretending to manage it with absolute precision. In that interaction between control and persistence, the decisive turning point was born, the collective understanding that emotional truth always finds a way, even when data disappears from the surface. From that moment, the tragedy began to acquire a broader meaning. The story no longer belonged solely to the realm of show business, but transformed into a debate on the need to preserve spaces where emotions can be expressed without fear, where memory does not depend on external authorization. Yu Menglong's case thus became a symbol of the permanent tension between human vulnerability and the structures attempting to regulate it. At that crossroads, the public discovered that remembering is not a passive gesture, but an act sustaining the dignity of those who, in life or in absence, have left a mark that no form of control can completely erase. The story that began with the silent disappearance of thousands of messages ended up revealing a truth that had been latent long before the tragedy became public. As the echo of events expanded beyond digital borders, it became evident that Yu Menglong's case did not belong solely to the intimate realm of mourning, nor to the restricted territory of the entertainment industry. It represented a crack in the polished surface of a system built to administer emotions, control narratives, and regulate the visibility of those wishing to express humanity in a space where even spontaneity had to adjust to a pre-established framework. What emerged from that crack was a deep reflection on the collective responsibility to preserve memory, especially when formal structures attempt to delimit it. The actor's presence persisted in discrete gestures, in rescued fragments, in the determination of a community refusing to allow a life to fade without leaving a trace. In that process, memory ceased to be a simple record to become a conscious act, a way of affirming that which the imposed silence attempted to dilute. Admirers discovered that remembering is not a passive exercise, but a form of cultural and emotional resistance. Every saved photograph, every translated comment, every re-uploaded video constituted a reminder that dignity does not depend on the permanence of material, but on the depth of the bond people build with those who touch their lives, even if from a screen. Analysts following the evolution of the phenomenon closely coincided that the story offered a crucial lesson on the limits of information control. Although a system can regulate the circulation of certain content, it cannot administer the emotional interpretation arising in those who observe it. The deliberate absence of data transforms into a clue, a void the public attempts to fill through the search for scattered fragments. Collective memory, autonomous and persistent, reveals the fragility of any structure pretending to completely mold social perception. The more a story is attempted to be restricted, the greater the impulse to reconstruct it, and in that movement lies a form of truth that can hardly be contained. From this understanding, the figure of Yu Menglong began to acquire a meaning transcending his artistic trajectory. It represented the persistence of light in an environment where darkness seemed to impose itself as the norm. It also represented the possibility that emotional truth would find a way, despite technical or administrative restrictions. His memory became integrated into a broader debate on the importance of protecting spaces where human emotions can be expressed without fear of disappearing. In that sense, the story ceased to be an individual tragedy to become a reminder that memory is a territory belonging not to institutions, but to those feeling the need to grant meaning to their experience. The future poses questions that still do not find a definitive answer. How will the relationship between the public and the structures administering information evolve? What forms will emotional expression adopt in an environment where memory can be so vulnerable and so resistant at the same time? Perhaps new forms of dialogue will emerge, allowing those working in highly regulated industries to find a greater space to express concerns without fear. Perhaps the value of remembering will acquire an even deeper meaning in a world where the visible and the invisible coexist with the same intensity. In any case, the intention is not to offer definitive certainties, but to open a reflection on the shared responsibility of preserving that which possesses human value. If you have reached this point, perhaps you wish to delve deeper into some aspect of this story, or explore other cases where memory and silence intertwine in a similar way. I will be here to continue the conversation and accompany you in any direction you choose to follow.